Well, let's get some perspective on the reopening of the Notre-Dame Cathedral with Andrew Smith. He's a lecturer at Queen Mary University who joins us now from London. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme today. The restoration took 5.5 years, as Macron promised it would. Could we call it a success, as he'd hoped?
I think absolutely. This does seem very much like a success. We saw, the extraordinary shock when, of course, the original fire took hold in April 2019. And we saw the way that was reported worldwide, the way that it shocked people. We saw tears outside and really a sense of something quite dramatic having happened, something momentous. Cathedrals take a long time to build, and this looks like a success. There's a famous work of medieval history by Jean Jampel, which is called The Cathedral Builders. Jean Jampel, of course, was a resistance fighter as well as a French historian, a bit like Marc Bloch, who'll be shortly inducted into the Panthéon. But I think one of the things in that book at the end of it, there's a kind of solemn note from the 16th century where it says, the great undertakings of the past are no longer possible since charity has grown cold. But I think what we've seen here, this is nearly €1 billion of donations, more than 250 companies, more than 2,000 craftsmen. A project which is led, which, of course, we have to remember took place during COVID, during all the things that have happened since 2019 and has been delivered. Of course, work still continues. Of course, it takes a long time to do. But a cathedral takes 200 years to build. And this, in 5 years, looks like an extraordinary project, a moment of success, which, Macron spoke there quite memorably about this idea of a shock of hope, about artisans having taken ashes and turned them into art and really transforming this space back into one of wonder. So I think absolutely that language of success is one that's really important to use in this moment.
Now, the fire made headlines across the world, as you very well may remember, and the cathedral collected hundreds of millions of euros in donations. But what is it about the Notre Dame that garnered so much international attention? I mean, why is it so emblematic?
Absolutely. I think one of the really important things is famously been dubbed, its parish is French history. Victor Hugo famously noted that time was the architect and the nation was the builder of these grand structures of Notre-Dame, the idea of the mighty magnetism of the bells that spoke out. These are really important. These were, a storehouse of national identity for France and a symbol, really, of French refinement for the rest of the world. Those bells, they've rung to mark revolution, they've rung to mark reaction, occupation, liberation. This is something which is seen as having withstood those tests of time. Built, of course, during the reign of the Capetian King Philip II, it survived all of these moments and seen something really, as Pierre Nora said, this is a site around which memory crystallizes, a place at the heart of French identity and seen as something symbolizing a vision of that grander sense of what Paris is and what it means to the world. And that, I think, is what's really important. The idea that it's used all these traditional crafts is so crucial. You saw, of course, the footage of those craftsmen, but actually this really was about almost like a return to the idea of a Republican monarch, the idea of Macron standing there surrounded by a crowd, addressing them and speaking about this moment of hope that this represents, is something which he said he hoped would be a kind of planetary shock in the same way as it was previously. That message of success, of hope, of restoration, of luminosity and light built back into that cathedral. That's where I think that combination of heritage, of ingenuity, of tradition, and of application has really combined to build something special in this reopening of Notre Dame.
Now, Macron's 2-hour visit was broadcast live. That he gave a speech and paid tribute to the craftsmanship of all those involved, as you just mentioned. Is there something to be said about the scale of the event today, especially given the context of the politics in France?
I think this is something to which Emmanuel Macron has consistently been committed, this idea of the roman national, the national story, the idea of myth. We've spoken, I mentioned there already, his nomination of Marc Bloch to be brought in and interred in the Panthéon, the national kind of mythology, the national story that moves around this. For somebody like Emmanuel Macron, I think he's very, very focused on the imagery of what France means. Those shots you can see of him talking and marveling at the traditional techniques that rebuilt those 13th century roofs, the idea of 2,000 trees used and cut in those traditional ways. The scale of this, I think, is seen as something which is really important. I saw a quite funny joke, I thought, from a journalist who said, if this was Britain, would still be waiting on the bat surveys. And I've seen people talking about the idea that this takes a huge effort. This is something which the state committed itself to and which it delivered. And actually, I think this is something which will outlast many of the kind of political arguments of the day, and something to which the idea of the presidency is much more focused. So I think this is something which is significant, something which is a major achievement in terms of the French state, and something which speaks more than to the state, to the idea of the nation. This is something inscribed in the history of France, and the parish of Notre-Dame is the history of France. And that really says something to restoring that moment. Really something marvelous, I think.
And just going back to the cathedral itself, what are some upcoming challenges for the cathedral in the future, if any?
Well, I mean, first of all, the biggest challenge is going to be dealing with the crowds as people queue to get back in to see it. Of course, they've spoken about its first ceremony that will be taking place tomorrow. I think we'll have a huge amount of interest already from people who want to go back in and see it. As we've heard, there are new things to be discovered. Old moments that we saw, kind of wonderful masterpieces around the cathedral, which have been unearthed, cast off the grime of centuries, accreted by the idea of people living and worshipping there. And actually, this is something quite new, a new rediscovery of Notre Dame. So that's going to be a big thing as well. Of course, there are wider issues that we'll see throughout this. Of course, there'll be issues around security. There'll be issues around kind of preserving and making sure that it's maintained. Of course, the scaffolding on the outside will maintain until next year, I think at least. There's work that continues on the roof and around it. But like we said, the cathedral took 200 years to build. If it takes an extra couple of months just to make sure that it's perfect, I think that's something that people can grant it. So there'll be lots of challenges to deal with in the weeks and months to come. But this is something which actually, in the course of those centuries, in those moments that it's seen since then, the barricades, the idea of gunshots ringing out at the liberation as Charles de Gaulle addressed the public, these are challenges which it has outlived, which it has outlasted. So those challenges, I think, will meet the French nation, the French state, and Notre Dame itself, are ones we have seen that can be overcome. I think that's the message of hope that comes from this, the idea of something reborn, that art from the ashes, that shock of hope that Macron spoke about.
Now that the Notre Dame is reopening its doors on December 7th, many will no doubt be queuing up to see the new and improved cathedral in the flesh, as you said. Now, the culture minister has suggested a €5 entrance fee to be imposed. What is your take on this proposal?
It's a challenge. We know that traditionally people don't charge to go into to churches, to cathedrals, but this does recognise the fact that this restoration has taken place because of those ideas of charity, of donations. Right after the fire in 2019, we saw almost €1 billion worth of funds donated. Of course, it was slow to collect at times. Why? Well, a little thing called COVID interrupted some of those, which changed the financial position of a lot of people. But actually, those ongoing challenges will be around restoration, will be around renovation, will be around ensuring that these same types of tragedy in terms of the fire don't happen again. And I think for that, sometimes it will be a small price to pay in terms of that. Of course, I think you will need to look at whether or not there can be free access on certain days. We know, of course, museums are open one day a month, free for people to visit. Perhaps there'll be an address in terms of looking at that type of thing as well. This is something which needs to represent the fact this is a working place of worship. This is a place that's important for French people, but it also needs to represent a place that can be kind of maintained, a place which is built by devotion and continues to be kind of restored by that devotion as well. As I mentioned right at the start, when Jean Jampel wrote about a kind of, the idea that charity has gone cold, I think this shows us a kind of rekindling of those moments. If that fire can do anything positive, it is perhaps in rekindling that flame of charity, the warmth of people contributing to this, those 2,000 craftsmen that poured their heart and soul and sweat into rebuilding this work of wonder. And that, I think, is the message of hope. And so €5 to go and see it, I think, sounds like a bargain at the price. But I hope as well that they will maintain access to ensure that ordinary people will be able to go and enjoy and pay tribute.
€5 is a bargain, says Andrew Smith from Queen Mary University. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on the program today.